Hello and welcome to this video on politics and testosterone. No, don't switch over to another video yet. We're not so much looking at the political aspect as the actual research on what strengths, weaknesses, flaws and merits it has. This is important as it's a single study of sorts that has led to claims that liberals have lower levels of testosterone. Now, how much truth there is to that, and how much of that truth is actually useful, is going to vary considerably based on how much weight you give this study, but that assumes the study itself has merit. Let's start with a few rather major considerations first. This is part of a doctoral thesis. That means it underwent some peer review processes, but not the full gamut. That is because the examiners are not looking for the same things as a peer review publication editor or a reviewer might be. For a PhD thesis, it is mainly the soundness of the methods, the reliability of the results, and how well articulated and substantiated the methods and then conclusions are. That is, has the candidate conducted their research in the correct way, obtained adequate results to substantiate their claims, and explained the results, implications, and consequences of these findings adequately. If so, the thesis will generally pass unless some extreme circumstances occur. With that said, we primarily need to note the absence of peer review. The thesis itself can be found at the link below. It is titled Essays in Behavioral Economics and Neuroeconomics. Specifically, we're going to jump straight to Chapter 2 on page 47 called Testosterone Administration Induces a Red Shift in Democrats. The first noteworthy element to this essay introduction and background is that 50% of political alignment, or at least according to the introduction and background, is based on genetics and 50% on personal experiences in early adulthood. That is, the non-genetic element rarely changes due to campaigning by politicians, and it means only half of political changes can be attributed to something like endogenous, or in this case exogenous, testosterone levels. Now for the, let's call it an experiment itself, and we have recruitment. The study initially recruited 164 males who were healthy with working gonads between March and November of 2011. This was partly to take advantage of the ongoing political activity of the upcoming election. The election was to choose between a Barack Obama for the Democrats and most likely Mitt Romney or Rick Perry from the Republican Party. Of the 164 recruits, 25 of them were excluded immediately as foreign nationals and therefore not eligible to vote. 3 participants were excluded for having testosterone levels outside of the normal range. This left them with 136 individuals and an average age of 22.3 years and standard deviation of 6.91. The study was 75% Caucasian, 11% Asian, 8% Latino, and 6% African American. 44% of these individuals self-identified as Democratic, 8.2% as Republican, and 29.1% were independent aligned. The remainder either not aligned or aligned with another party that wasn't specified. The author notes only men were included, as the tea preparation we used, Androgel 1%, is FDA approved for men only. And this does speak to why it's only males that have been represented in this. Overall, the basics of the study are reasonably sound, even if the sample is too small to extrapolate this beyond the scope of the study. The other minor issue is that the researchers chose to remove the arguably control group of non-eligible voters who could have acted as a means of assessing if it was exposure to political things or political alignment that caused the changes at hand. There's also some concerns about the limited representation of Republicans, but the author admits this is a limitation of the study later. There is also the standard deviation, 6.91 years and an average age of 22.3 years. That means with one standard deviation, they'd be recruiting 18-year-olds up to 26-year-olds. While yes, they relied on recruiting campus attendees, this is still heavily biased towards a young group, who are generally more liberal than older people, which may have skewed results beyond the scope of just being happy-go-lucky college kids. Even though that is a concern, you have to conduct your research with what you have, and this is all recognized as a limitation by the author. So most of this is fairly understandable and, if not arguably sound, certainly not something that destroys the basics of the research. Now for the methods. The participants had 20 milliliters of blood, so your standard blood vial drawn from one of their veins by a phlebotomist. This was before anything else, and it gave them what's called basal total T levels, or testosterone levels, before any other work is done. This means that they can measure it and say, before anything happens, any exposure, any politics, this is what they are. Essentially a before and after snapshot. 16 hours later, individuals returned to the laboratory, and they had a second blood draw. Now, there are two issues with this. The first regards their choice of what testosterone they're measuring, and in this case, they're choosing to measure the total testosterone amount. This is described as being highly correlated, but that's an issue. Highly correlated is not the same as best practice, most suitable, or reliable. This does raise some concerns about whether or not a single sample and time comparison is appropriate or reliable enough, but it's a weakness to the study, not a critical flaw. After the first blood draw is conducted and they return 16 hours later, they enter into a private room and they had their shirt removed and they were given a colourless hydroalcoholic gel. Now neither the recipient nor the researchers knew what this was, so it was a double-blind trial, and it contained either just the alcohol-based gel or 10 grams of the androgel. 55.8% of the individuals received the treatment, let's say. This double-blind approach and the use of what is effectively exactly the same product with the active ingredient diluted into it is arguably the best, if not gold standard approach. A little can be said about this that would be negative or critical. In fact, it is arguably the opposite. A double-blind study should be praised, and it is as strong as you can get. Individuals were given questionnaires, and these questionnaires were given both at first attending and after the second attendance. The questionnaires measured things like demographics, emotional responses, an anger inventory was provided, along with political preferences. Now, political preferences were obtained by ascertaining the strength of party affiliation, and that involved the use of a feeling thermometer. They measured the feeling thermometer by looking at 5 Democratic nominees: Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, and Harry Reid, against 5 Republicans: Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Mike Huckabee, and Rand Paul. They then also ran a parallel assessment. By having the 0 to 100 measure on the feeling thermometer for these individuals, they were able to get an average. So you have individual candidate response plus an average response. The theory of it is that the higher the score, the greater the favorability of the person who's filling it out for that individual. Surveys. This design is arguably better than the recent TLDR business survey of the same type, but still. This is looking to establish a strength of political affiliation along with emotions and anger. The concern is averaging perception of 5 different politicians or nominees for each party. To use a current example, imagine having to average Biden, Harris, Cortez, and a few other Democrats against Trump, DeSantis, Ramaswamy, and a few others. You could get some extreme responses, and it could vary considerably by political affiliation. It is true that in 2011 the results may not have been as extreme, but even with that in mind, this seems prone to being skewed. Especially as already noted, there is a rather large Democratic population in this study. Now we have division and results, let's say. Dividing it by the participants in the placebo group and the treatment group, they found that there was no significant change from before and after treatment. So this really isn't a surprise. There shouldn't be a change. You haven't given them anything. and the split for the difference is pretty much equal. So the placebo group and the control group pretty much had what you'd expect to see, but there's no mention of a power calculation, and that's an issue. A power calculation is what would tell you how many people needed to be used if the results obtained were to have significance. It's, as said, also a good thing the placebo group did not change. If they had, then the whole design would need to be thrown out and redone. Now that they have knowledge about the testosterone levels for each group, their political alignment, emotions, and so on, they conducted analyses, and this was done with statistics. Again, very much the things you should be doing, unlike TLDR business. The caveat here is that they did a one-way ANOVA test, and although, yes, it did find statistical significance, a one-way ANOVA test seems wrong in this case. The variable is testosterone, or at least the fixed variable is, but you have a before and after result, so this is now two variables. But then you also have political alignment and the strength of that alignment. And this means we now have two or more variables that are arguably independent. More so when they are then going to run the same test post-treatment to figure out your political alignment with Democrat or Republican, your testosterone level before and after, and yeah, it seems like they should have run something like a factorial ANOVA test, not a one-way ANOVA test. But nonetheless, we have what we have. Next was the measurement of testosterone by party affiliation. Effectively, are they a strong to weak Democrat or a weak to strong Republican in that spectrum? Yeah. They also removed all independents from this, so they didn't count a surprisingly large proportion of the people that they had recruited, which is a significant worry. To be clear, when you have 30% of the participants that you have recruited and you take them out of your study, you have a problem. 30% of your data is just gone. The short result out of this is that if you gave testosterone to Democrats, it would affect their perception of the party, but only if they were weakly Democratic. And this is clear enough to know. It's good to know if there's a dose response, however, and this is what they don't tell us. That is, they don't tell us the strength of the affiliation other than it's weakly Democratic, nor do they tell us the significant change in the testosterone as a dose response. It's just a broad weak affiliation. It'll be better described as a model of the dose response for how much testosterone changed by, and how much the attitudes of the individuals involved shifted in response, but they don't appear to provide us with that. Further to the Democratic side of things, the Republican side, although it is a tiny analysis, didn't really show any change. That is, there wasn't any net alteration in how Republicans saw Democrats or the Republican Party based on testosterone levels. Nor was there any real change in self-reported things like anger or similar, whereas there does appear to be slight differences in the Democratic group. We can't really make any significant claims about this, nor should the author have either, and it's interesting in that they have, given that the response was from a very small subset of the participants. It's a fractional number of Republican-aligned individuals in this study. It is no small challenge to make any significant claims when you're relying on such a small subset. The shift on the part of Democratic-aligned individuals was that their, let's say, approval of the Republican Party increased by over 18% based on a single dose of testosterone roughly 16-ish hours earlier. That's a surprisingly, let's say, degree of change rather than strength of change, but it also raises issue with the sample size and strength of relationship, simply because we don't know how far the original position was and how far it shifted for an individual given on how much testosterone they absorbed. all of this raises issues with something of the sample size and strength of relationship, not just for the Democrats but for the Republicans, but at least for the Democrats it's clear enough that we can say there's something there. The weakness of this study is, well, as the author admits, underrepresentation for Republicans, and they explain this away as a function of using a convenient sample of college students. Future research they explain as a possible option would be to, well, test testosterone on older adults and females, test whether or not direct administration of testosterone, or by priming individuals with videos to see what happens with endogenous testosterone production. The reality that the PhD candidate recognizes all these shortcomings of the research is, well, nothing short of praiseworthy in terms of the fact that this is likely many years of work, and they're sitting there going, and these are all the things that are wrong with it. There is the inevitable correction we have to make for people misunderstanding this, and that is that the research has been very much misunderstood. It did not measure the amount of testosterone in Democrats or liberals, or rather how much the exogenous testosterone increased their testosterone level by, and then how they viewed political parties following that. There is no internal or endogenous measure of testosterone. And this leads to what is arguably the fundamental misunderstanding of the study. Those who read it take these results to mean that liberals have lower testosterone and conservatives have higher testosterone. That's simply not what they've tried to investigate. Instead, it is that individuals are more likely to change their political view, albeit slightly, when exposed to exogenous testosterone to a more arguably conservative viewpoint. However, strongly held democratic beliefs, or a liberal belief if you will, and arguably Republicans do not experience this. However, Republican results in this study should largely be ignored for the reasons of very low representation. What you can take away, as the heading so to say, is that those who are weakly aligned with the liberal or democratic side of the spectrum are more likely to view conservatism more favorably when exposed to testosterone from outside their body, which is arguably not going to be that frequent an affair. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.